It's a very special privilege and a great honor for me to welcome you all to this very special occasion. I do notice that there are many empty chairs in front, and typically we occupy the back seats first, right? And that I'm not saying anything, right? I know that taking the front seats always difficult, but when the front seats are so empty, it's particularly interesting. I guess those front seats are for the latecomers. So, allow me, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, to acknowledge our Dean, Professor Mpedi, Executive Dean of the Faculty of Law, Professor Thabo Legwaila, our inductee this evening, Judge Dennis Davis, our respondent to the inaugural professorial address this evening, many senior leaders and senior academics of the university. A warm welcome also to members of Senate and other academics. A very special welcome to Mrs. Legwaila Junior, shall I say, as well as Senior, Upu Senior, Junior, and Senior Umama. A warm and very special welcome to your brother, Uboti Okanye, your brother here, didn't make it, as well as, of course, mother-in-law, Mama. Yes, a warm welcome to you as well, ma'am, and of course to your children. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a very special occasion, this. It is very special because of its setting. Many of you will have experienced something interesting of observing all of these protection services personnel, which signals to us that we're in a different moment in time. I say different moment in time, but also, as I always argue here at the University of Johannesburg, that while it is a time of great challenge for our universities and for our nation, it is at the same time a moment of great possibility, a moment of great opportunity, and therefore it is our duty to seize the moment, to seize the opportunity, to make sure that a crisis does not go to waste. And so this evening's occasion is very special, because this evening we induct into the most senior ranks of the academic community a very special South African. A South African that we will learn of later in summary form when he is introduced by Professor Mpedi, but also very special because the fact of the black African professor is still nowhere near the critical mass that it must become in the immediate future, not into the far future. And so the fact that we inaugurate this evening a young man from Limpopo is a very special occasion, and I hope that all of that will not be lost as we turn our attention to the official business of this evening. And so I want to therefore express a very warm welcome to Professor Legwaila and his loved ones, his special guests and his colleagues, who are making this a very special occasion. Well, it's also his birthday. He is 4 decades old today. So it's even more special, this occasion, because 40 is a particularly interesting turning point in one's life journey. And so we also extend our warm congratulations to him on having reached this milestone of 40 years as well. And so it's a proud and a joyful moment for you. It's a landmark moment for you. But for us also here at UJ, importantly for higher education in South Africa, in Africa, and beyond our shores. Now, inaugurations, many a time pompous and decadent, and obviously subject to the decolonization and Africanization project in the immediate term, these hopefully are mostly dignified, well-meaning, and unsullied. At least we're told. They date back to the time, at least in modern history, of ancient Greece, and you can see what I mean by modern, as the opportunity for the formal investiture of a person into high office, and it marks the formal assumption of that high authority. And today then marks the rites of passage and the entry of Professor Legwaila into the distinguished community of our universities, here and beyond, as I've said, most senior scholars. This is an office and a position of authority and leadership which we shall not assume lightly, but shall do so with considerable and ongoing thought, reflection, deliberation, and dare I add, presence of mind. And so the professorial inauguration is as important to the incumbent and their loved ones and colleagues as it is to the university. I say this since the inaugural lecture is as much a reflection on the state and the intent of the contemporary university and how it measures up to Professor Legwaila's inaugural lecture. And so inasmuch as it is him reflecting on his scholarly evolution and coming to be, it is also a reflection on the state of the university. And so through his inaugural lecture this evening, we will see far more than meets the eye, as he explores with us the impact of the rapidly increasing conundrum of curbing tax avoidance through the use of interest in South Africa and internationally. On these auspicious occasions, I often remark on and remind us of one Martin Gregorian's hopefulness and controversy, even more so in our current context, when he announced to us that universities are not only repositories of past human endeavor, they are instruments of civilization, he holds. They provide tools for learning, for understanding, and for progress. They are the wellspring of action, a source of self-renewal, of intellectual growth, and of hope. And he concludes they are medium of progress, of autonomy, of empowerment, of independence, and of self-determination. And yet at the same time, I offer us Wernick's argument, this is the neo-Marxist argument, that the university has a contradictory relationship with its surrounding society. On the one hand, the autonomy in terms of its axial values of truth, of wisdom, of science, and so on. And on the other side, those who control the means of material production control the means of mental production. And the dominant ideas are the ideas of those who dominate, which of course raises fundamental questions of Gregorian's idea of civilization. What is the meaning of civilization? in our postmodern world. I also offer the reflections of Professor Emmanuel Wollaston, speaking not so long ago here at the Humanities Lecture Series at UJ. In considering his own journey, he observes that it seems to me that it's the duty of the scholar to be politically and intellectually subversive of received truths, but that the only way the subversion can be socially useful is if it reflects a serious attempt to engage with and understand the real world as best as we can. I'm also reminded, as I often do on these occasions, to share the point that very few books are available, as in decent bookstores, on what it is to be a professor, and in particular, what the freedoms and duties of this most senior scholar of the university is. In this regard, I offer the reflections of Bruce Mcfarland, a distinguished visiting professor here at the University of Johannesburg, who's based at Hong Kong University, who in his book, Intellectual Leadership and Higher Education, Renewing the Role of the University Professor, seeks to correct this oversight and argues, I believe convincingly, that given the corporatization of the research agenda, professors must reclaim professorial leadership, and they thus occupy a very special role. Specifically, Mcfarland argues that two freedoms, that of critic and advocate, are essential for professors to execute their four duties: of mentor, of guardian of standards, of the enabler of networking and mobilizing opportunities and resources for others, and fourth, of being ambassador for the institute or for the discipline. And so this evening we will only have one very small insight into how our colleague, Professor Legwaila, responds to this call for the return of professorial leadership. Allow me now to invite the Executive Dean, who himself is now in his third month, to introduce for us Professor Legwaila. I thank you.
The Vice-Chancellor of the University of Johannesburg, Professor Ihron Rensburg, Judge Dennis Davis, Professor Legwaila and family. I must acknowledge my fellow deans, Professor Amanda Dempsey and Acting Dean, Dr. Shahid Nala, distinguished guests, colleagues at the faculty, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. You don't sound happy. Good evening. Professor Thabo Legwaila is the son of the late Mr. Khotso Daniel Legwaila and Mrs. Makwena Diana Legwaila. He grew up in Mcfarland in the Limpopo province and matriculated at DG Tsebe High School. Prof. Legwaila holds B.Juris degree from the University of Venda, an LLB and LLM from Wits University, a postgraduate diploma in tax law, and an LLM from the University of Cape Town, and he obtained a Doctor of Laws in tax law degree from the University of Pretoria in 2010. Prof. Legwaila started his career as a lecturer and advanced to senior lecturer in the Department of Mercantile Law at the University of Stellenbosch. He was later invited to Harvard University, where he spent time as a research fellow in the Harvard University International Tax Program. He subsequently moved into tax consultancy at KPMG as a senior tax consultant in international tax, and later to Ernst & Young as tax manager in the International Tax Department. In 2006, Prof. Legwaila joined the South African National Treasury as a Director of Business Tax, where his role was to develop the South African business tax policy, as well as manage general tax legislative amendments and specific business law amendments. He left the National Treasury in 2011 to join Citibank as head of tax for the Africa the African division. Prof. Legwaila is a member of the Davis Tax Committee, which was formed by the South African Minister of Finance to inquire into the role of the South African tax system in the promotion of inclusive economic growth, employment creation, development, and fiscal sustainability. Prof. Legwaila published widely in tax law, both in accredited and peer-reviewed journals, as well as in magazines and newsletters. He also co-authored the textbook Tax Law and Introduction, which is specifically intended at explaining a vast terrain of tax law to students. Prof. Legwaila is married to Mrs. Thandiwe Legwaila and is blessed with 2 children, Khotso and Moradi Kurapetsi Warabile.
Thank you very much for that. It kind of changes the mood. It makes it a little bit emotional. Thank you very much, Vice-Chancellor, Dean, Professor Mpedi, Letlhokwa, Judge Dennis Davis, thank you very much, and good evening to friends and family as well. Good evening, and thank you very much for being here with us. You know, it is very difficult to keep people interested in a tax discussion. And you know, with students it's easy because they know they have to study, so they have to listen to you. With an audience like you, I know what you're interested in is whether you should pay or you shouldn't, more whether you should not pay or than you should pay. But I thought that I would bring to your attention or analyze quite briefly the impact that the development of the tax laws has had on the use of interest as a form of financing. So that long topic, that long title that Professor Rensburg read, basically is, you can shorten it to say, the taxation of interest, basically. It has become very difficult, as I will show. So the question is, what is interest? Interest is payment for the use of money. You detain money, you pay interest. In very simple terms. It's nothing complicated. What we do is, in order to determine the taxability of any item in South Africa, we look at the Income Tax Act, which currently does not have a general definition of interest. It's got an anti-avoidance definition contained in Section 24J of the Income Tax Act. However, and as it is, I mean, interest is a simple instrument. Interest is easy to tax unless there are structures that come up that are intended to avoid the tax. Dr. Ketch, I'm used to you nodding all the time, so you should nod to keep me going. So, if interest is used in its simplest form, it's easy to tax. But now, because of all these structures that have come up that are intended to avoid the tax, a lot of countries have developed anti-avoidance measures that deal with interest. In South Africa, we've got the normal anti-avoidance measure in the form of the substance over form doctrine that we always talk about. It's a common law solution where we look at the substance of the transaction versus the form. If they don't match, we attach the tax implications to the substance. We also have the general anti-avoidance provisions that are contained in Section 80A to L that target transactions that are intended to impermissibly avoid the tax. So these general provisions used to be sufficient to deal with interest, but with the development of business, the the cunningness and the brazenness of the business world, it has become not enough to use these instruments on their own as a way of combating tax avoidance. So there have been a development of specific anti-avoidance measures that actually, and this is the point of my lecture today, that actually make it such that working with interest is so complicated that it would be difficult for anybody to determine what the implications would be unless they engage in a rigorous research or consultation to determine what the implications would be. These are those provisions. We've got the withholding tax on interest, transfer pricing and thin capitalization provisions, the limitation of interest on debts owed to non-taxable persons, limitation on interest deductions in respect of reorganization and acquisition transactions, operating company acquisitions resulting in a group, and also the developments that have come up as a result of the G20 and the OECD coming up with the base erosion and profit shifting action plans. So with the withholding tax on interest, what happens is this applies when a tax resident of South Africa pays interest to a non-resident. So a loan comes into South Africa, a South African resident pays interest. Because South Africa does not have jurisdiction over the non-resident, South Africa needs to exercise its source rights to tax the particular item of income, which is interest, and as a result, we impose a withholding tax on the interest payable to the non-resident. The interest has to be sourced in South Africa and has to be paid to a foreign person or for the benefit of a foreign person. There are various exemptions. There's an exemption for banks, the Reserve Bank and the IDC and the Development Bank. So where any bank pays interest, that interest would be exempt. There's a beautiful exemption for interest paid on listed bonds. There is an exemption for interest paid by the government in any of its spheres, and specific interest paid by a headquarter company in respect of granting financial assistance. There is an anti-avoidance measure there which seeks to curb this avoidance or potential avoidance that could come up with back-to-back arrangements where interest is paid to a bank and then by a bank in order to avoid the income tax. That is the first. And then we've got thin capitalization provisions that existed specifically until 2012, which were replaced or with a new provision or just building it into Section 31 transfer pricing provisions, which basically apply to interest paid by a resident to a connected person. Transfer pricing is, what is transfer pricing? You know, when you think about transfer pricing, a gentleman that I met last year, December, said that he has always heard about transfer pricing and he thinks that transfer pricing is when you get into a shop. And when you get into the shop, you look at the prices, you find that an item that you want to buy is very pricey, so you go to an item that is cheaper, you remove the price tag and you paste it on the other item. That is not what transfer pricing is. So transfer pricing is the process in terms of which a person or related parties rearrange the pricing of the services and goods in order to ensure that the profits are taxed in low tax jurisdictions and their expenditure is deductible in low tax jurisdictions. So what in 2012 what we did, or what the government did, was to incorporate the thin cap rules which relate to financing an entity with more debt than you should in order to derive a deductible interest that could be taxed at lower rates in the other country. So those provisions actually apply, or rather they focus on cross-border transactions, operation schemes and arrangements and understandings which are effected between or undertaken for the benefit of connected persons. And that includes loans, advances, debts, securities or guarantees. The tests, when I studied tax at UCT, and Dennis Davis over here spoke about arm's length. For me, it just didn't make sense. Arm's length is that what I'm showing over there. So I didn't understand exactly what it meant, but basically it means that you look at the transaction and you compare it with a transaction or the conditions of a transaction that would have existed had the two parties or the parties in that transaction been acting independently or not related altogether, because each party would want to derive the best out of that transaction. So the current test goes into the amount that a third party would have been able to borrow had the transaction been concluded in an open market, and then you also determine the lending capacity by taking into account the terms and conditions which have been applicable between independent parties. There is a new test that has been brought in by the draft interpretation note that talks about whether a party could have borrowed that much and whether they would have been able to get that much in loan. If the transaction fails the test, you have two adjustments, the primary and the secondary adjustments on that. That is the second one. Now, it gets more complicated because now more and more provisions apply to the same transactions. Now, we've got Section 23M that came into the Income Tax Act that is basically concerned with limiting interest on debts owed to non-taxable persons. So simply put, it's a resident pays interest to a person that is not taxable. So because a resident will be able to deduct that amount, the fiscus is deprived of the ability to tax that amount where the recipient is not taxable because they are exempt or they are not resident in the country. So this provision also comes in and needs to be featured in where there is a direct or indirect holding of 50% of equity shares in the particular country. Interest deductibility in this case is limited in terms of a formula, and disallowed interest is carried forward. We also have Section 23N that limits deductions on interest in respect of reorganization and acquisition transactions. This provision replaced Section 23K, which granted the Commissioner the powers to actually, or the discretion to decide whether interest could be deductible or not. Comes into place as well. And then we also have Section 24O that looks at operating company acquisitions which result in a group relationship. So you basically, in this regard, is a positive for taxpayers in that you deem interest incurred in the acquisition of equity share in an operating company to be incurred in the production of income, laid out and expended for purposes of trade, and actually received as income in the hands of the payee of the interest. And then, in addition to all that, there are hybrid avoidance rules, like Section 8F that deems interest on hybrid debt instruments to be dividends. And also Section 8FA that deems hybrid interest to be a dividend in specie. There are also dividend conversions. So basically what these rules do is that both the interest deeming provisions and the dividend conversions, what they basically do is they deprive the payor the ability to deduct at the same time they impose a tax on the payee of that interest. That's all what that says. And then there are cases that have been decided on our anti-avoidance measures. Those are not the kind of cases that I'm talking about. I just wanted to show you cases. It's the three cases, the case of NWK, the case of Rochcon and Bosch, that actually spoke about the anti-avoidance measure that I spoke about earlier, the substance over form. And then, in addition to that, the OECD has come up to say there is a lot of base erosion and profit shifting. You hear about this in political areas as well. I've heard it a couple of times and I was very impressed. There was somebody that said that one party joined parliament and then got there and educated everybody on BEPS. So base erosion and profit shifting is really, really concerned about the movement of income from high tax jurisdiction to low tax jurisdictions. And for interest purposes, there are hybrid mismatch rules which take advantage of the fact that interest is treated differently in the one country and in another way in another country. There are controlled foreign company rules in Action 3 and interest and payment equivalents in Action 4, which is the latter which I want to dwell on a little bit. So what the OECD says is that when you've got interest and payments that are economically equivalent to interest, there is a lot of potential base erosion and profit shifting. And this relates to, this can be done through the use of interest on all forms of debt, payments economically equivalent to interest, and expenses incurred in connection with the raising of finance. Examples are those listed over there. Now, the OECD suggests rules in order to limit that, or in order to curb avoidance using that, one of which is the fixed ratio rule, which limits interest deductions to a fixed percentage of earnings before interest, tax, and depreciation and amortization, with a benchmark of about 10 to 30%. This ensures that deductions are linked to economic activity. An advantage of which is that it is simple for taxpayers to determine and figure out how it works, and for tax administrators to administer as well. The disadvantages are that there are different sectors with different leverage needs or leverage desires, which would mean that a fixed rule would not apply, and that there are a lot of entities that enter into transactions without an interest in avoiding tax for non-tax reasons. In addition to that, maybe in a way to ease the limit or the fixation of the percentage, there's a group ratio rule, which basically says that if you exceed your fixed ratio, you can use the higher of the group's net third-party interest expense or group EBITDA ratio. In addition, there are targeted rules that I don't want to really bother you about. I'm trying to figure out if your eyes are still open, by the way. Now, what are the observations from this? What do we see? I mean, obviously, you see overregulation. You get worried. You think, are we striking a good balance between protecting the South African tax base and adhering to the tenets of taxation? Most importantly, certainty and simplicity. In that taxes are supposed to be certain. When a taxpayer thinks of investing in South Africa, tax should not be the first thing they think about. You know, that is where tax professionals always talk about the tax tail working the investment dog. You find that you make your decision because of tax reasons, which is not right. It also raises the cost of compliance. In that in that way, it kind of compromises the efficiency of taxation. Taxation should be easy. It should be easy to pay tax. So when you raise the cost of tax compliance, you make it burdensome for the taxpayer, and then at the same time you benefit the tax advisors and lawyers. And I believe there's a lot of them over here. Frank Musuba is one of them. And then there is also a little bit of a conflict with the interest of the country, trying to make sure that the headquarter company regime increases or attracts investment into South Africa. So with that, I mean, government made a very good intention to develop the tax system or to change the tax system such that it encourages investment. So when you've got such burdensome provisions as dealing with interest, it would be very difficult for a system that has been developed. I mean, I developed this with Charles Magola at the National Treasury, and maybe your involvement is the reason why it doesn't work well. But the intention being to make it work. If it does, if you then bring about provisions that would not make it work, it becomes quite inappropriate, or it's taking 2 steps forward and then taking 3 steps back. There are a few solutions. There are a lot of solutions that can come to help in this. In that you can unify the deductibility of tax or rules that relate to the deductibility of tax, such that a person needs to look at one provision and find out whether they will be able to deduct or not. or you can unify just the tax treatment of interest, such that you've got a provision that deals with interest and makes it easy for investors to look and know how to work. Or alternatively, you can tune specific rules. Like when I spoke about the controlling relationship, you would see that the controlling relationship, it requires that there be about a 50% holding. If you up that percentage, then you would reduce the number of transactions to which the limitations would apply. And then also, finally, you could use supplementary interpretative resources like draft and interpretation notes in order to clarify the application of taxation on interest. I hope that is not too complicated for you guys to swallow. Thank you very much. If anybody has questions on this, don't come to me. There are consultants in here. I would like to take a few minutes, very few minutes, to acknowledge a number of people and events, and also reflect a little bit on my own, my life up to here. Professor Mpedi mentioned that I am the son of Mr. Thabo Legwaila, my dad, who passed away in 2006. Great guy, great man. He had a very strong, relentless belief that if you study and you get educated, you shall not suffer. And he meant that not only economically, but also mentally, that you would be able to live. And I think that at this very moment, it is very important for me to make you aware of how important that father has been to my life as I grew up. I was a kind of a naughty boy, ma. But I think they just didn't understand me. So that I was beaten up a lot for being naughty. My mother over there, ma ugoleme lembalwona. She and I, 40 years and 1 day ago, met. And ever since then, she's been a pillar of my strength. She didn't believe in me a lot. You know, she was a teacher, but she never taught English. She taught Afrikaans and Sepedi. And every time she would speak English, I would listen carefully because I thought I would get a way of correcting her. And one of the words or one of the phrases that she used to like saying was that in relation to how disobedient I was, all these dreams that I'm building are like building a castle on air. She used to say that a lot until I got my first degree, and she said, I think that castle is coming up. And thank you very much, Ma, for raising me. I know I was a tough one. Now, seated next to Bomma is my mother-in-law, Mama. Maupaga. This is probably the only opportunity I'll ever get to get her to stand up on my instruction. And Manpepetra, my mother's younger sister, very important person in my life that has had a lot of faith in me. Manpepetra Emela. My wife has always been a pillar of support and encouragement to me. Sometimes you think that things are anticlimaxes where you get a doctorate and you're like, so what? She always used to say to me, look, it's gonna mature, it's gonna flourish. And I kept on that. She always makes me believe that if I don't do well, I will be dumped. And trust you me, she's close, I believe that. She's seated over there. And my kids, Khotso and Moradi. Khotso, where are you, Papa? There he is. As you would tell, he's named after my dad. He looks like him as well. And Moradi is sleeping over there on his mom, on her mom. Khotso was born in 2005. I was about 29, and it was tough at that point to have a child. But you know, these kids, they make me who I am. They make me work. I go to work because of them. I always tell them that I go to work because of you. And it always humbles me how Khotso looks at me with pride, and how he's confident to be around me. He's proud. He is. When he was asked at school some time ago to write a presentation about his role model, I was out of the country, and he wrote this pamphlet on me. Isn't that beautiful? That is quite encouraging. That is quite humbling as well. My in-laws, I will thank you as well. Thank you very much for being here, and for all your support, for all your, you know, whenever my wife and I have squabbles, I know who to talk to in your family, not mine. You know, thank you very much. And that includes friends-in-law and colleagues-in-law. Right? You know, in my in-laws, there is a man, Oswarlunga Nogaya. Swarlunga Nogaya was one of those, like Swarling Konmali, who were very excited about coming to this. You know, Swarlunga was very happy, very excited. He got so excited that he actually got a heart attack. And literally he did, just that it was mild. He couldn't be here with us, but he would have loved to be here with us. And I really, really would like to say to you, would you please have him in your prayers as well? He's a very good guy with a good heart. I mean, no pun intended. During the infancy of my tax studies, I was motivated very much by Judge Dennis Davis. He became my lecturer. When I expressed my intention to do my doctorate, he was interested in supervising me. But, you know, we had one meeting when he said to me that I think your understanding of tax is still lacking. You need to do a module in tax, an additional module in tax. So I had to do Tax 2 at UCT, which ended up with me doing my second master's degree. And I finished it, and because I moved and all that, he couldn't supervise me. Part of his support for me, I mean, when I was doing my second master's with him, as Professor Mpedi said, I spent a little bit of time in Harvard, and Judge Davis happened to be going to the US, to New York, and made time to come meet with me at Harvard for lunch. I believe that was not the only reason, but he did come to meet with me. And he expressed to me how he believed that I would make it, and that I've got the right attitude and all that. And I mean, this finds me with him now in the Davis Tax Committee, as Professor Mpedi said. Thank you very much, Dennis. Judge. Professor Franson was my supervisor for my doctorate. He's not able to be here, but he was very patient with me. He was very patient, very, very patient, and I felt like he worked on it more than I did. And I would really, really like to thank him. My former boss, Keith Engel, I don't know if he's here. He's always late, but he just didn't make it. And I always say that I'll always be indebted to him because he grew me in relation to my tax knowledge and all that. You know, growing is very interesting. Israel Legwaila, where are you, Dr. Aye? Yeah, Israel Legwaila and I were walking in our home village in Botswana, Matatane, one day, when I told him that, you know what, Israel, I want to make money very quickly. And therefore, I think if I do a B admin and not the law field, I would start earning 2 years before I would if I studied law. And Israel said to me, you know what? If you do that, you're going to start earning 2 years before you would if you study law, but you're going to be miserable for the rest of your life because you would be doing something that you would not like. Thank you very much, Dr. Israel Legwaila. He spent the whole day traveling from Botswana to attend this event with us. Thanks, Dr. A. Now, when I left KPMG, I joined Ernst & Young. I worked with Rendani. Would you be seen over there? Rendani was my boss at EY. She so much believed in me, she pushed me all the time. She wanted me to do more. That made us fight a lot. I'm like, why should I be working so hard? You know, she is the one boss that I fought with more than any other person in the world. And thank you very much for those fights, Rendani. I actually ended up telling her, she was a partner, I was like a tax manager, and I said to her, you know what, Rendani? I don't want to be like you. You know, if becoming a partner means that I should listen to you, then maybe I shouldn't. I'm not blaming you for leaving EY, by the way. And Professor Annette Ogutu, thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for your mentorship, for your belief in me, for your assistance. You know, Annette, in addition to helping me with my doctorate, Annette helped me with believing in what I think, believing in what I say, just by her responses to what I say, acknowledging what I say. Thank you very much, Annette. Thank you very much. And just towards the end, I would like to thank the University of Johannesburg through the agency of Professor Kathleen van der Linde. Where are you, Kathleen? Oh, I can't find you, yeah. Kathleen and or Professor van der Linde and Professor O'Brien, the former dean, gave me an opportunity. They learned about me from Professor Khalid's, and there she is seated over there. We graduated together, by the way. We got our doctorates together. And as we were sitting there, she asked me, why don't you join UJ? And I think that's not the most exciting thing to hear at that point. Anyway, Professor van der Linde and Professor O'Brien gave me an opportunity to join the university to teach on a part-time basis until this appointment, and I've always been grateful for that. I find that I've always wanted to become a professor. I've always loved teaching. And if you're patient with me, I can stand here for another 3 hours, trust me. I've always loved teaching, and as a result, this is a great opportunity. It's a great opportunity for me. It's a great opportunity for my family, for my friends, and I believe for the country at large. Thank you very much. Professor Mpedi, you're leading us very well, keeping us motivated. You're like a brother to me, and I'm not being racist here, right? You're like a brother to me. I always find that your leadership will be very, very, very good for us going forward, and all the good advice that you've given me. In the end of it all, friends, colleagues, and everybody, I really, really thank you for being here. Your mere presence shows that you've got interest in my life, you've got interest in my progress, in my work, and in my everything. And I'm very appreciative of that. I thank you very, very much. Let's just do a round of applause to all of us, please. And finally, we thank God for the air we breathe. Thank you.
Vice-Chancellor, the Dean, ladies and gentlemen, it's, as the Vice-Chancellor quite rightly said, an inaugural lecture is a very special moment in the university's life, and it's a very special moment in somebody who's attained the level of a professor. And it's a particularly special moment for somebody to reflect on an inaugural lecture who was once the teacher of somebody who's a professor. It really is. It makes, and there are many teachers in this room, it really makes teaching worthwhile. I want to come back there at the end of my 5 minutes, which I've been strictly told is what I have. Something like the United States Supreme Court, where you only get very short time to talk. But let me address perhaps firstly the topic. In the few remarks I want to make, I want to say firstly, you did an extraordinary job, Thabo, of passing through an incredibly complicated area of law. I think probably this is one of the most complicated areas of tax law that there is. And what it reflects is exactly what you opened up your lecture in saying, is that depending on the tax law, economic behavior patterns in one or other way. So when you get an opportunity to read the text which is outside, you'll notice that early on in his lecture, Thabo makes the point that the way in which companies finance their activities is to a large degree, has been largely fashioned by the way in which tax operates. And to a large degree, therefore, it means that you get a shift from equity capital to debt capital because it's financially efficacious. The real question you want to then ask yourself is whether that's really to the advantage of the economy as a whole. And so the foregrounding of this paper, which he's delivered tonight, really raises this very important question which vexes tax lawyers and tax policy makers the world over in general and South Africa in particular. The second point that I think comes out of this is we're part of the global world. Sometimes I think we forget that. The problem about an economy like ours, a small open economy, is that we're constantly challenged by being part of the global world in an open way. And that means that to a large extent, our revenue department, our SARS, are having to deal with complicated structures which are foisted upon them by multinational corporations. When I started teaching tax, which was a very, very long time ago, it was such an easy topic to teach because we were in an apartheid South Africa regime. There was no international tax. International tax for South Africa was the Transkei. We sometimes forget from where we've come. It is now an enormously complicated field, and as Thabo put up section after section, you probably realized what that was about was as the multinational corporations figure out sophisticated schemes to reduce the tax, particularly, I might add, in developing countries like ours, who really get the short straw. And that's a really important developmental question which emerges out of this paper as well. Then the tax system becomes more and more complicated, and the only redistribution that then takes place is between clients who are redistributing their resources to tax advisors. And it's a seriously problematic question. The third point that I'd like to make in these few comments available to me is the importance, however, of getting that balance right, which is what Professor Legwaila spoke about, I think, very astutely, in making the point that you've got to balance the efficiency and the simplicity of the system against the hemorrhaging of the fiscal base. Now, for many of you, this may well be somewhat of an arcane topic if you're not into tax. But let me explain why it's not arcane, and why it's so important, and why, in fact, what has been spoken about tonight is really of critical interest to all citizens in this country. A week ago, Minister of Finance Pravin Gordhan delivered the budget speech. You will notice that in the budget, he basically raised our taxes so that he could, adjusting for minor fiscal drag, and I won't go into that, basically we raised an additional 18 billion rand. And the reason we did that, we all know, is you had to reduce extravagant expenditure, push taxes up by 18 billion in order to ensure that the deficit before borrowing was relatively manageable, because what we forget is that one of the largest items in our budget is the interest that we pay on the debt that we run. It's over 100 billion rand, almost 11% of our tax take goes to pay interest. Now, that could go to schools, that could go to this university and other universities, it goes to a whole range of things. So you've got to manage this. And 18 billion. I can't tell you, having been involved deeply with this budget, just how difficult it was to work out how to get 18 billion. Why do I mention this? Because I'm quite convinced that the hemorrhaging as a result of much of what was spoken about tonight probably has, if not 18 billion, certainly 6, 7, 8 billion floating around there, which would make a heck of a difference. Get your system right, get your administration right, and to a large degree, you start then ensuring that the amount of tax that we collect comes from those who truly can afford it. Because one of the most disturbing features of our tax system and our tax context is that we keep on having to worry about troubling middle-class people who really aren't earning very much money to stem that flow of the debt gap. Whereas, in fact, what we should be doing is ensuring that corporations around the world who come into this country pay their fair share. Not more, but their fair share. And that's why much of what was spoken about tonight vexes us on the Tax Commission and is so relevant, not just to us as arcane tax practitioners, but to the public at large. So this is a very important contribution to the debate, and I'm extremely grateful for the fact that you've aired it. And it's for that reason, perhaps just my last minute, I'm so delighted that Thabo is now on our Tax Commission. In fact, he now and I, apart from all else, have to deal with a report on tax administration. Bearing in mind the various ructions at SARS, I'm so happy he's there to negotiate with me through all of this difficulty. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, Dean, let me just end by, I started off by saying how proud I am as a teacher to see where a student has come from. I've had a rather strange week in this regard. Last night, I inaugurated a book of another ex-student of mine, David Coulthard, who's a very famous Zimbabwean. He's written an extraordinary book about Zimbabwe, and I said, and he comes from a very different background to Thabo's. You know, he was, as he said, a white Rhodesian who finally embraced a non-racial society in Zimbabwe. So on my Monday night, there I was celebrating an ex-student of mine and celebrating with great joy that he had done what he'd done, and tonight the same. Somebody who has already made a contribution and is going to make a far greater contribution to the same project, if you think about it, to a non-racial transformed society. And that is really something we should celebrate. So tonight for me, it's not just about me saying, gee, look where a student of mine has come from. It's the joy that I'm sure I share with all in academic life, that we are producing people of the quality of Professor Legwaila, people who are going to make the kind of contribution to our society, which means that the present ructions will pass and we will reach that kind of egalitarian future that we strive for. And perhaps as a result of having a tax system that collects its proper share. We're truly in your debt, and you've given me great joy tonight.
Well, there we have it. Any doubts that this is a professor here? All right, you can talk to me afterwards. So I just want to begin also by extending sincere appreciation, Judge. Thank you very much for those wonderful insights that you have shared, which gave a particularly interesting perspective on Professor Legwaila's lecture this evening. And please, there are copies of his lecture outside for those of you who are now excited by the lecture, by Judge Dennis's remarks. Please feel free to take a copy. I hope when I go home there won't be any copies left there. So I want then also to conclude before we do the formal investiture into the office by extending to you, Thabo, Professor Legwaila, again on our collective behalf here at the university, our very best wishes on this journey. You will be a very important role model in this university and beyond. And we only look forward and wish you the very best in this journey. We know that you will rise to the occasion. We're confident that you're going to add enormously to your field of knowledge, and in turn to South Africa, to Africa, and to the world. It is evident that our universities are going to be vital and critical as Africa evolves over the next 2 generations, from a 1.2 billion population to a 4.2 billion population. And so our universities, with you at its helm, are in a very important place to secure the future, or, put differently, to assure a different kind of future for our people, and in turn for Africa in the world. And so we wish you well in this journey, because long after we are gone, you will continue and rise to this clarion call. So congratulations again. And so I invite Judge Davis and the Dean of Mpedi to do the formal business.
The University of Johannesburg. Rethink, reinvent.